Yes, good evening. Hirsch Sar here, reporting from Auckland, New Zealand, as usual. I'm not sure if I remembered to say that in my last video, but okay. Reporting from Auckland, New Zealand, as usual. And today is Wednesday, the 27th of May, 2026. Already explained in my previous video, bit of stubble around here. Basically, been working from home this week, so I haven't really needed to go out a lot. So that's why you've got that. And yes, I still need to work on that, don't I? Geez, that thing's sticking out there. Anyway, so yes, an interesting topic for this talk video is facts aren't always reliable. We tend to see evidence as evidence, facts as absolute, and they are not always the case because sometimes even those so-called facts or evidence are not telling the whole story, or are only based on so much, or sometimes even misconstrued. It's amazing how you can almost argue any side of any controversy or argument just based on which facts you use, and then again how you present them, and what you say, and of course what you don't say, things like that. But really, something we need to remember, of course, doesn't mean we don't rely on facts and evidence and other people's research and work to date. Of course, we should. But, you just need to really keep this in mind. And it probably just means that you just need to do more research, look into more sources, gather as many facts, as much as evidence as possible. But facts aren't really always as they seem. And I remember reading this example from a book years ago, and it's one that really jumped out at me, and I'll never forget it. And it was saying, okay, there was an organization which were recruiting to fill up the positions they had available, and when they recruited people, interestingly, 90% of the men who applied for a job at this organization got it. However, only 50% of the women who applied for a job at this organization got one. And then, after hearing that, okay, 90% of men who applied for a job, they got it, but only 50% of women who applied for a job, they got it. And if you are asked the question, would you call this organization sexist? And most people say, oh, of course, definitely. That's horrible. Almost all the men who applied for a job, they got it, but only half the women who applied for a job, they got it. That's horrible. It needs to be on a much more equal footing, right? And of course, I would agree. And I would say the same would go for not just different genders, but, different races, religions, origins, citizenship, all those things, all those things. So, but let's look into it deeper. It is true that at this organization, 90% of the men, geez, saying it for a third time now, aren't I? 90% of the men who applied for a job, they got it, but only 50% of the women who applied for a job, they got it. Well, let's look into it a bit deeper. And this is something else we must always remember. And of course, it's something probably a lot of the time we fail to do, and of course, myself included. You really need to go in depth and look into it closely. It's like they say, when you don't know the full story, not only should you not judge when you don't know the full story, you can't judge when you don't know the full story. Simple as that. But looking at this organization, at this example a bit further, it so happened to be a primary school. This organization, you're probably thinking of it as an office or a business, but it so happened to be a primary school, right? And they had 29 teaching positions available for teachers at the primary school. It so happened that they hired for those 29 positions, 20 women and 9 men for those teaching positions. And funnily enough, for the 9 men who got those jobs, 10 men had applied for them, and then 9 out of the 10 got it. Geez, the one who probably missed out was probably me. But so that's where that statistic or that fact came from. 90% of the men who applied for a job at this school, this organization, got it. Because out of the 9 men who got a job there, 10 had applied for one. However, only 50% of women who applied for a job there got it because of the remaining 20 positions, 9 positions were given to men. The other 20 positions, teaching positions, were given to women. And it just so happened that 40 women applied for those 20 positions. 20 got it. So therefore, 50% of women who applied for a job there got it, right? So it looks as if they were discriminating against women, but if anything, you could argue they're actually discriminating against men because in the end, oh, stupid Snapchat going, this phone never gives you a break, does it? Put that away. that's the that's the time we live in, right? The day and age we live in. But so where was I? So happens that that 20 that of the 29 positions available at the school, nine were given to men, 20 were given to women. You could actually argue that if anything, they were actually discriminatory against men, not women, because they employed 9 men, but they employed 20 women. They actually employed more women than men, over twice as many women as men. But that it just so happened that fact came out because of the number of people who applied for the positions in the first place from each gender. 10 men applied for those 9 positions, 9 got them, 90%. There's your 90%. However, for the other 20 positions, 40 women applied for those 20 positions and 20 got them. 50%. So it's interesting. You could say, oh, what a horribly, sexually, discriminatory school or organization it was, because 90% of men who applied for a job there got it, but only 50% of the women who applied for a job there got it. But when you look into it deeper, they actually hired more women than men. It's just many more women applied for the job in the first place. That's why that percentage of women who got the job was lower, even though they actually employed over twice as many women as men. So again, things aren't always as they seem. Not all facts are reliable. We've heard the saying, there are no facts, merely interpretations. So I think there's a lot of truth to that. And again, it just means that you really need to look at something more in depth before coming or jumping to a conclusion. You really need to do your research. You really need to know the full story. You really need to gather as much evidence as possible rather than just relying on a few facts. And again, certainly an eye opener. So once more, things aren't always as they seem. Not all facts or evidence are reliable. Thank you.